All right, so here's a tip for improvisation, which is about learning to see certain structures or devices as smaller pieces of information as opposed to part of a whole scale. And this isn't saying don't learn scales, but instead to be able to see small bits without making a huge switch in the way that we're thinking. So it's kind of confusing to describe in words, but let me use a musical example, and I think it'll make sense. So if I'm playing a 2-5 in C, I might play this stock lick. Okay, that's all diatonic to C major, totally cool. But what if I wanted to make this typical alteration? Now, that would immediately make most people go, I have to use another scale to get the flat 9, because A flat isn't diatonic to C. And what I'm saying is that you can view that as a small alteration without making a drastic change in thought process. You know, you could think up a diminished 7th arpeggio, or 3-5-7 flat 9, or even more simply just up an arpeggio and flattening the 3rd, or flattening the 9, excuse me. You don't always need to think so big in terms of like, okay, that note comes from C harmonic minor, or G mixo flat 9 flat 13, or Phrygian dominant, or maybe it's A flat melodic minor or G altered. You know, you can let yourself see things in a context other than the scale that it technically comes from. Even though you can analyze something and say, this is the most theoretically correct explanation, that doesn't mean you have to constantly think about it that way when you're making music on the fly. So take another example of a similar lick. Now, that's even more modified in terms of not being diatonic. But again, you can look at this in so many smaller ways that aren't in the context of a big scale. You could see this dyad from F minor resolving to this one from C. You could say typical enclosure from below with the flat 9. You could say chord tone targeting minor 4 to 1. You know, there are so many ways to describe and catalog something that don't involve drastic measures. Like, imagine if you were bound to saying, okay, all C major, Op G, mixo flat 9, bebop flat 13 for 3 notes, and then back to C major for 1 note. You know, it's just like so overly cumbersome and confusing, if you ask me. Another great example is using an augmented triad on a 5 chord. Like, you know, that doesn't need to come from a symmetrical scale or melodic minor or anything. It's okay to just think augmented triad on the 5, you know? All right, I hope that makes sense. Toy around with that, see if it helps you out a bit. Go get them.